The silence of the high country was a thing with weight. In the autumn of 1884, it pressed down on Ezra Shaw's shoulders like a physical burden, a shroud woven from grief and the vast, indifferent sky. His cabin, nestled in a fold of the Bighorn Mountains, was less a home than a tombstone for a life that had ended 2 years prior. He had built it with his own hands, for Hannah. He had felled the lodgepole pines, notched the logs, and chinked the gaps with mud and moss, his laughter mixing with hers as they planned the window that would catch the morning sun. Now, the sun only seemed to highlight the dust motes dancing in the empty spaces where she used to be. Ezra's days had collapsed into a brutal, simple rhythm dictated by necessity. Chop wood, check the trap lines, hunt, eat, sleep. The routine was a bulwark against memory, a way to exhaust his body so his mind had no energy left to wander down the painful corridors of the past. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to his horse, a stoic grey gelding named Gus, whose quiet companionship was the only kind Ezra could tolerate. The men in the nearest town, a grimy collection of saloons and mercantiles a 2-day ride away, had long since stopped trying to draw him out. They saw him as a man hollowed out by loss, a ghost haunting his own claim. They were not wrong. He had come west with Hannah seeking promise, a piece of land to call their own, free from the crowded, grasping world back east. They had found it, or so they thought, but the land that promised freedom also demanded a price. A swift and merciless fever had taken Hannah and their infant son, Walter, in the space of a single week, leaving Ezra in a silence so profound it roared in his ears. He had buried them on the rise behind the cabin, beneath a lone aspen whose leaves trembled in the wind like 1,000 unshed tears. He had remained, not out of hope, but out of a stubborn inertia. This was the last place they had been together. To leave felt like a final, unbearable abandonment. So he endured. He became a creature of the mountains, his face weathered like the granite cliffs, his eyes holding the same distant, guarded expression as the deer he hunted. The wilderness was his penance and his sanctuary. It was a place big enough to contain his sorrow, a place where no one would ask him to smile or pretend that the gaping wound in his soul had healed. He was an island, surrounded by a sea of whispering pines and crushing quiet, and that was how he intended to remain. The first snows came early that year, not with the gentle grace of a dusting, but with the sudden violence of an ambush. A low, slate-gray sky snagged on the peaks and tore itself open. The wind, which had been a mournful sigh for weeks, rose to a vicious, shrieking howl. Ezra had been checking a line of snares miles from his cabin when the storm hit, a whiteout so thick he could not see Gus's ears from the saddle. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the terrain he knew as intimately as his own scarred hands, his beard freezing to the collar of his coat. It was in the swirling chaos of snow and wind that he found them. At first, he thought they were just a strange mound in the snow, a drift piled against a fallen log. But then the mound moved. Gus shied, letting out a nervous snort. Ezra dismounted, his rifle held ready, his mind racing through possibility: a wounded bear, a cougar. He moved closer, squinting against the stinging flakes. It was not an animal, it was people. A woman was huddled over 2 small children, her own body a desperate, failing shield against the blizzard. Her blanket was thin, caked with ice, and her face, when she looked up, was a mask of exhausted terror. She was Cheyenne, her features sharp and proud, even in her wretched state. A boy of about 7 or 8 years old glared at Ezra with a ferocity that was startling in such a small frame, his arm slung protectively around a younger girl who was barely more than a toddler. A short distance away, a horse lay dead in the snow, its legs stiff and awkward. They were stranded, freezing, and on the verge of death. For a long moment, Ezra stood frozen, the wind tearing at him. Every instinct, honed by 2 years of solitude and the bitter prejudice of the frontier, screamed at him to turn away. They were not his concern. He had his own grief to carry, his own survival to ensure. He had nothing left to give. He had walled himself off from the world of the living for a reason. To let them in, to acknowledge their suffering, would be to breach the very defenses that kept him numb. But then the little girl whimpered, a sound so thin and frail it was nearly stolen by the wind. It was a sound that cut through the layers of ice around Ezra's heart, a ghostly echo of his own son's cries. He saw Hannah's face for a fleeting, agonizing second, saw her bending over Walter's cradle. The ghosts in his cabin were no longer quiet. They were screaming. With a curse that was half prayer, half groan, he lowered his rifle. He could not leave them. He could not be the kind of man who watched children freeze to death, no matter how much he wished he could be. The part of him that was Hannah's husband, that was Walter's father, was not entirely dead after all. It was buried deep, but it was there. He gestured with his head, a sharp, commanding jerk back toward the direction of his cabin. "Come on," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Get up." The woman, whose name was Vivina, understood the gesture, if not the words. With a monumental effort, she got to her feet, swaying, pulling her children with her. The boy, Honyahaka, did not let go of his sister. Ezra scooped the little girl into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, her small body shivering uncontrollably. He wrapped her in his own coat, the sudden warmth from his body making her sigh. He led them toward the faint promise of shelter, a small, grim procession against the fury of the storm, the weight of the child in his arms, both a burden and a strange, unwelcome comfort. The cabin, when they finally stumbled into it, was a shock of warmth and stillness after the howling chaos outside. Ezra slammed the door against the storm and bolted it, the sound unnervously final. He gently set the little girl down on the bearskin rug before the hearth, where embers still glowed. Vivina immediately collapsed beside her, pulling the boy close. They huddled together, a small island of fear in his quiet, masculine space. Ezra moved with a stiff, functional purpose, his mind refusing to process the full implication of what he had done. He threw logs onto the fire, coaxing it back to a roaring blaze. He ladled stew from the pot he'd left simmering into 3 bowls, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man long accustomed to caring only for himself. He set the bowls on the floor near them, along with a tin cup of water, and then retreated to the far side of the room. He sat in his customary chair, his rifle across his lap, and watched them. The silence in the room was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of grief, but a tense, charged silence of mistrust. Vivina and her children ate the stew with a desperate hunger, their eyes darting toward him, assessing him. He was the enemy, the white man, the encroacher, yet he had given them shelter and food. They did not understand. Honyahaka, the boy, stared at him with an unblinking, hostile gaze, his small jaw set in a hard line. He was the man of his family now, and Ezra was a threat until proven otherwise. Ezra met the boy's gaze and felt a flicker of something akin to respect. He saw a protector, not just a child. He looked away, his own gaze falling on the small, empty cradle he'd never had the heart to dismantle. It sat in the corner, draped in a dusty sheet, a monument to a future that had been stolen from him. The presence of these children, this family, made its emptiness ache with a renewed intensity. He had invited the world back in, and it was already reopening old wounds. The blizzard raged for 3 days. The world outside the cabin's single window was a churning vortex of white. They were trapped, 4 strangers bound by a storm and a single fragile roof. The rhythms of their forced cohabitation were awkward and halting. Ezra kept the fire fed and brought in snow to melt for water. Vivina tended to her children, speaking to them in the soft, flowing cadences of the Cheyenne language, her voice a strange music in the silent cabin. Ezra found himself watching them more than he intended. He watched the way Vivina would patiently untangle her daughter's hair with her fingers. He watched Honyahaka, who, despite his suspicion, would instinctively add small sticks to the woodpile whenever Ezra brought in a new load. They were a unit, a tightly woven braid of love and reliance. It was a language he understood, even if he could not speak a word of theirs. One afternoon, the little girl, who had been listless and quiet, took a tentative step away from her mother and toddled toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her dark, curious eyes fixed on him. She was holding a small, smooth stone. She held it out to him, a silent offering. Ezra froze. His hands, calloused and stained from work, felt clumsy and huge. He didn't know what to do. Vavina made a soft sound, but didn't stop her. Honyahaka watched, his body tense, ready to spring. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Ezra slowly reached out and took the stone. It was cool and perfect in his palm. He looked at the little girl and managed a stiff, unpracticed nod. She gave him a small, hesitant smile before scurrying back to her mother. He didn't know why, but he put the stone in his pocket. He found his fingers tracing its smooth surface throughout the rest of the day. A simple, childish gift had breached his defenses more effectively than any weapon could have. It was a crack in the dam of his isolation. That night, the temperature plummeted further. The wind found every tiny crack in the cabins chinking, and icy drafts snaked across the floor. The fire, though large, seemed to fight a losing battle against the encroaching cold. Ezra gave them all of his blankets, piling them onto the makeshift bed Vavina had made for the children near the hearth. He himself sat in his chair, wrapped in his heavy coat, dozing fitfully. He was woken by a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was Vavina humming. It was a low, mournful lullaby, a melody of such profound sadness and love that it seemed to settle in the air like dust. She was rocking her daughter, who was coughing, a dry, rattling sound that sent a spike of fear through Ezra. He knew that cough. It was the sound of lungs filling with fluid, the harbinger of the fever that had taken his own son. In the flickering firelight, he saw Vavina's face. It was a landscape of worry. She looked up and her eyes met his across the room. In that shared glance, all the barriers of language and culture dissolved. He saw not a Cheyenne woman, but a mother, terrified of losing her child. And she saw not a hostile white man, but someone who understood that fear. The shared terror of parenthood was a language they both spoke fluently. Without a word, he got up and went to his medicine chest. He took out a jar of pungent salve, a mixture of pine tar and eucalyptus he used for his own chest colds. He knelt beside her, a silent question in his eyes. She hesitated for only a second before nodding, unbuttoning the top of her daughter's tunic. Gently, his rough hands surprisingly deft, Ezra rubbed the salve onto the child's small chest. The sharp, medicinal scent filled the cabin, mingling with the smell of wood smoke. As he worked, he found himself speaking, the words spilling out of him in a low whisper, not to her, but to the ghosts in the room. Hannah, she made something like this, with mint from the creek bed. Walter, he had a cough like this right before. He trailed off, his throat closing around the memory. Vavina did not understand his words, but she heard the raw grief in his tone. She watched his face, saw the pain that etched new lines around his eyes. When he was finished, she touched her own chest and whispered a single word, Moketavato. Then she pointed to the sky. It was a name and a destination, a husband, a father, lost. Ezra nodded slowly. He understood. In that moment, they were no longer strangers. They were two people who had lost everything, bound together by a storm and the shared, universal grammar of sorrow. The storm did not relent. It tightened its grip, squeezing the world in a fist of ice. The wind became a physical force, shaking the very logs of the cabin. A fine powder of snow began to blow through the cracks around the door and window frame, piling in little drifts on the floor. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping to dangerous levels. The little girl's cough grew worse, her breaths coming in shallow, labored rasps. She was burning with fever. Ezra knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the air, that they were in a race they were losing. He had a dwindling pile of firewood, and the storm made it impossible to gather more. The wood he had was burning too quickly. The desperate heat it produced, swallowed almost immediately by the profound cold. They were all shivering now, huddled together near the hearth. The fire, a flickering beacon of defiance against an ocean of cold. He looked at Vivina, her face illuminated by the struggling flames. She was holding her daughter, rocking her, her own body trembling with cold and fear. He looked at Honyahaka, who had his arms wrapped around his mother, trying to share his meager warmth, his face a mask of grim resolve. And Ezra saw himself not as their reluctant host, but as their protector. It was a feeling he thought had been buried with his family. The reawakening of it was a searing pain, but it was also the first thing he had truly felt in 2 years. It was a sign that he was still alive. He knew what he had to do. The decision formed not as a thought, but as a cold, hard certainty in his gut. His gaze swept over the single room, over the meager possessions that were the relics of his past life, and then his eyes settled on the interior wall. It was the wall he had built to separate their small bedroom from the main living area. It was made of the same thick, seasoned pine as the rest of the cabin. It was the wall he and Hannah had stood against, dreaming of the children who would one day fill the house with noise. Behind it was the bed he had built for them, the bed she had died in. Behind it was the empty cradle. It was a wall of memory, a wall of grief. It was the architecture of his sorrow. He stood up. The movement was sudden, decisive. He walked to the corner and picked up his felling axe. Vivina flinched, her eyes wide with alarm, pulling her children closer. Honyahaka scrambled to his feet, placing himself between Ezra and his mother, a small, defiant warrior. He thought Ezra had finally broken, that he meant to harm them. Ezra looked at the boy, and for the first time he offered a small, grim smile. He shook his head, then turned his back on them. He faced the wall. He hefted the axe, the familiar weight of it a comfort in his hands, and with a guttural cry that was a mixture of rage and grief and a desperate burgeoning hope, he swung. The first blow was like a thunderclap inside the small cabin. Wood splintered. Vivina gasped. The axe bit deep into the wood of his own home. He swung again, and again, the rhythmic thud of the blade, a savage drumbeat against the howl of the wind. He was not just chopping wood, he was tearing down his own shrine to sorrow. Each swing was a blow against the silence, against the grief that had held him captive. He splintered the doorframe to the bedroom, the shelves Hannah had admired, the posts of the bed where his world had ended. He worked with a feverish intensity, sweat freezing on his brow despite the exertion. He tore the seasoned planks free and threw them onto the fire. The flames leaped up, roaring with new life, devouring the pieces of his past and turning them into heat, into life. The fire blazed, pushing back the cold, filling the cabin with a fierce, brilliant light. The temperature began to rise. When he was done, he was panting, his arms aching. The interior of his cabin was a ruin. The bedroom was gone, exposed. The cradle stood starkly in the open, but the room was warm. It was blessedly, life-givingly warm. The little girl's shivering began to subside, her breathing seeming to ease just a little in the dry heat. Ezra dropped the axe and sank to the floor, exhausted. He leaned his back against the one remaining wall. Vivina stared at him, her expression one of awe and disbelief. She finally understood. He had not destroyed his home, he had sacrificed it. He had torn down the walls of his own heart to keep her children warm. Slowly she moved, guiding her children to the other side of the roaring fire. They sat there, the four of them, sharing the warmth born from the destruction of his past. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the heart of the blizzard, inside the wreckage of the cabin, something new was being forged in the flames. The storm broke 2 days later. The sun that rose was pale and watery, illuminating a world transformed, buried under a sea of silent, pristine snow. The devastation was absolute. Trees were snapped, their branches littering the drifts like broken bones. The world was beautiful and terrible. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace held. The little girl's fever had broken, her breathing was easier. The immense heat from the sacrificial fire had turned the tide. They had survived. But Ezra's home was a shell. The rear of the cabin was now open to the elements, a gaping wound he had temporarily plugged with hides and blankets. His sacrifice had saved them for the night, but it had doomed his own chances of surviving the rest of the long, brutal winter. Vivina knew this. As she packed their few belongings, her movements were full of a quiet, somber gravity. She looked at the destroyed interior, at the man who had given up everything for them. Her gaze held a depth of gratitude that words could never convey. Honyahaka, too, seemed to understand. The hostility was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. He approached Ezra, who was staring out the door at the endless snow, and touched his arm. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, adult understanding, and then returned to his mother's side. Ezra helped them rig a travois for the little girl, using branches from a fallen pine. He gave them the last of his dried venison and half a sack of flour. He knew it wasn't much, but it was all he had left. He pointed them south, toward a valley where he knew the Cheyenne sometimes wintered. It was a long shot, a desperate hope. "Go carefully," he said, knowing they would not understand the words but hoping they would hear the intent. Vivina met his gaze. She placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward him. It was a gesture of immense respect and thanks. Then she turned, and with her son beside her, began the long, slow journey, pulling her daughter through the deep snow. Ezra watched until they were just small, dark specks against the blinding white. Then they were gone. He turned back to his ruined cabin. The silence rushed back in, but it had changed. It was no longer the oppressive, heavy silence of grief. It was just quiet. It was the silence of a man who had emptied himself out completely. He was alone, his shelter compromised, his food stores nearly gone. By all logic, he should have been terrified. Instead, he felt a strange and hollow peace. He had done one good thing. If he were to die here, buried by the snows, his life would not have ended as a complete failure. He had shared his fire. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard, desperate labor. He scavenged wood from fallen trees, a back-breaking task in the deep snow. He painstakingly rebuilt the wall, using green, unseasoned logs that wept sap and would offer poor insulation. He hunted, but game was scarce, driven out or buried by the storm. He grew thin, his clothes hanging off his frame. He was living on the very edge of existence, but he worked with a grim determination he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just waiting to die. He was fighting to live. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set, painting the snow in shades of rose and violet, he saw movement on the horizon. He squinted, his heart giving a strange leap. He thought at first it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a herd of elk, but the shapes were wrong. They were human. It wasn't just 2 or 3 figures. It was a procession, dozens of them, moving steadily across the snow-covered valley toward his cabin. His first instinct was fear. He grabbed his rifle, his mind flashing to stories of raids and conflict. But as they drew closer, he saw a familiar figure at the front. It was Honyahaka, walking proud and straight, and beside him, Vivina. They were not coming for revenge. They were leading their entire village to his door. Ezra stood in front of his ramshackle cabin, his rifle held loosely at his side, as the entire band of Cheyenne approached. Warriors on horseback, families pulling travois loaded with supplies, children and elders. They stopped a respectful distance away, their collective gaze upon him. An old man, a chief with a face like a weathered map of the mountains, dismounted and walked toward him, flanked by Vivina and Honyahaka. Vivina spoke to the chief in their tongue, her hands gesturing toward Ezra, toward the broken cabin, her voice full of an earnest power. The chief listened, then turned his ancient, intelligent eyes on Ezra. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, and Vivina translated, her English halting but clear. "She tells me, you burn your home to save my daughter's daughter. You burn your memories to to give them warmth. Ezra could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. The chief surveyed the patched, flimsy wall Ezra had erected. He shook his head slightly, not in disapproval, but with a different understanding. "This is not a winter house," Vivina translated. "This is a grave." Then the chief gave a command, and the village came to life. It was not an attack, it was an act of creation. The men, warriors and builders alike, descended on his cabin. With an efficiency that astonished him, they dismantled his clumsy repairs. They brought their own tools, their own knowledge, honed by centuries of surviving these harsh winters. They cut and notched new, dry logs from a hidden copse they knew of. They mixed mud with grass, creating a chinking that was far superior to his own. They worked together, a symphony of purpose. The women came forward, unloading supplies. They brought tanned buffalo hides, thick and warm, to line the interior walls. They brought sacks of dried corn, smoked fish, and pemmican. They built a fire in his hearth and began to cook, filling the air with smells that made his empty stomach ache with a hunger that was for more than just food. The children, at first shy, began to play in the snow, their laughter ringing out in the quiet valley, a sound of impossible life. But they did not stop at rebuilding his cabin. As the men worked on his shelter, the others began to set up their own lodges. Tipis rose from the snow, their painted hides bright against the white landscape. They arranged them in a wide, deliberate circle, with Ezra's newly fortified cabin standing right at the center. They were not just visiting. They were not just repaying a debt. They had moved their entire winter camp. They had brought their village to him. By nightfall, the work was done. Ezra stood in the doorway of a home that was stronger and warmer than anything he could have built himself. A fire roared in the hearth, and a thick stew bubbled in a pot. Outside, the warm lights of a dozen lodges glowed under the stars. The silence of the valley was gone, replaced by the soft murmur of a community, the cry of a baby, the nicker of horses. Vivina and Honyahaka brought him a bowl of the stew. He sat on a stool they had brought for him and ate, the warmth spreading through his bones. He was no longer an island. He looked out at the circle of Tipis, at the people who had surrounded him with their lives. He had torn down a house of grief, a monument to all he had lost. In its place, and all around it, they had built him a home. He was no longer Ezra Shaw, the lonely widower. He was the man who had shared his fire, and a whole people had come to share their world with him. In the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, surrounded by strangers who had become his neighbors, his protectors, his family, Ezra felt the first, tentative stirrings of a new life beginning. He was, at long last, home.